Welcome to the beginner's tutorial for the Southwater dress. As this is a very simple dress, I'm going to go right back to basics. So this is my pattern and I'm just going to show you where I've put some notches. This one I marked on for my side slit. I'll come back to that in a minute. I measured it up from the bottom, but there are some that are already marked on. So if you're new, these little marks are called notches. We've got a dart, we've got a notch around the sleeve too. I usually mark these with my scissors and do a little snip, but I'm going to show you with my chalk just so that it's a bit more obvious for you to see on the screen. You can use chalk, you can use your scissors and do, look, there's my little snip there if you prefer, or you can do just a little bit of thread, tacking thread, do a little stitch. That's the point of my dart. So I need to mark the wide point with my chalk and my little snips, but the point I've marked, as you can see, I put a pin in there, so I'm keeping that pin there so that I know that's where my bust dart ends. Just marking the other dart, the other notches as I go down. Whoops, you can see there's my little snip actually there. So I'm just marking them with chalk so they're a bit more obvious. Let's come back to this one. This was 35 centimetres from the hem, and I marked that from the size that I was working with, which is a 16 in this instance. So I've measured from the hem of the 16 up 35 centimetres. Depending how long your legs are or how tall you are or whatever, you might want to adjust that for you. So now I'm going to mark this dart with some chalk as well, but I'm going to transfer this bust point here. You can see I'd pinned through all the layers, so I can see the tiny bit of pin there, so that I know is my point of my dart there on that side, and I'm going to transfer the pins so that I know exactly where it is on there too. Pop a pin in that one. That's it. So I can take all the other pins out now. I know exactly where my bust point is. Okay, so you can see my chalky marks here from my notches. Doesn't matter if they're on the right side or the wrong side because they will rub off. You can also see my little snips there. Now I'm going to put these bust points, mark those on the inside. So I just flip that over and you can see there's little holes in the fabric where the pin was. So that's my bust point, and I'm going to do the same with this pin as well. Where is it? There we go. Just transfer it onto the wrong side because I want to mark my dart on the wrong side. If you're not new to sewing, you won't necessarily want to do it this way, but this is the clearest way to know that you've got your dart in the correct place and you've taken the correct amount of fabric for it. So there are my notches. Mark those on the wrong side now just so that I know where I'm coming from. That's the wide end of the wedge. Start at that point, just make that a bit clearer. So from that point, I'm just marking in chalk down to where those notches were at the side. So I end up with my lovely little triangle, and that's all marked on the wrong side of the fabric. Just making that bust point clearer. There we go. So you just want to do that on the other side as well. So let's look at the notches on the back panel. You've got one in the armhole, which is a double notch. So there's two lines always on the back armhole. Just one single one on the front. That's how you know when you're cutting your sleeves which is the front and the back. So I'm going to just mark with my chalk. I've done my little snips as well, but just so that they don't get lost, and you may feel more confident with chalk or a pencil or one of those Frixion pens. You've got two darts at the side. This one matches the bust dart. The second one is just a notch that matches a notch on the other side of the side seam. And you've got this one too. Mark it on both sides. Fab. So there you go, you can see the little snips that I've done as well. Do need to keep those small though because your seam allowance is only 1 centimetre. And you just need to measure up again from your hem 35 centimetres if that's your chosen length of opening at the bottom. Next we're going to do some stay stitching around the neckline so they don't stretch. This neckline's quite scooped out, so it can stretch and distort if you're not careful. So I'm just going to stitch within the 1 centimetre seam allowance. It doesn't have to be exactly 1 centimetre, just inside that. And I'm using a 4 stitch length, mainly because I don't want it to be gathers, but I don't need it to be tiny. It's just to hold the shape so that it doesn't stretch while I'm handling it. So there we go. And that's what it looks like. Like I said, it's within the 1 centimetre, so it won't show when you've stitched the facing on later. Going to do the same for the back neck. This one won't stretch quite as much, but it's these curved bits that tend to, if they're going to, and some fabrics are more stretchy than others. So again, as long as it's within the seam allowance, it doesn't matter whereabouts the stitch line is or how wobbly it is. It's literally just to hold the shape until we've got the facing on. Okay, let's stitch these darts now. So here we go. This is the front dress. You can see the stay stitching around the neckline, and you can just about see the chalk of the dart here. It doesn't show up too well. I'll show you a bit closer. There we go. You can see where I've marked it. So I want to fold it with the right sides together, and I'm matching up those little snip lines, and also I'm just going to pin through the chalk line. There's the bust point there that I'd marked, so I'm going to pop a pin in perpendicular to that, just so that I know that's where I need to stop, because it tapers off to that point. Let's put a couple more pins in. And like I say, I'm just trying to push it through the chalk line to the other chalk line on the other side and just lay those pins along the chalk line. There we go, so that it just shows you exactly where to stitch. If you're a beginner, again, I would strongly advise you to get your needle and thread out and tack these before you machine them, just because having pins in can make it a bit more fiddly and a bit more tricky when you're sewing it. So if you're not too confident, having a tack line in there will make it much easier. Here we go. So starting at those snippy ends, my machine does an automatic back stitch. If yours doesn't, you might want to just do a tiny little back tack before you get going. And then I'm following that pin line and the chalk line and just tapering off and coming right off once I get to that point. Just keeping stitching and just running the machine right off the fabric. There we go. So you should have something that looks a bit like that. And it should follow your chalk line or your tack line. Show you on the right side. Looks quite neat. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to just fold that dart down towards the hem. This part should be in line with the side seam, and I'm going to give it a press. There we go. So I've pressed it now. So when I sew the side seams, those edges there will all be in alignment. So just repeat for the other dart now. Okay, so now we're going to do some overlocking, or I'm going to do some overlocking. But I just want to show anybody that doesn't have an overlocker how we can neaten this edge nicely. I'm going to stitch with a straight stitch right close to the edge now, and I'm using a number 3 on my machine. I don't use tiny stitches because they're terrible to unpick. We all do it, so don't use too small a stitch at this point. So I'm literally just stitching as close to the edge as I can. There we go. It's a millimetre or 2 in. Next, that's the really important step so that it doesn't stretch. Next, I'm going to trim off the hairy bits and I'm going to do a zigzag over the top of the straight stitch. Like I say, if you go straight in with the zigzag, it can still stretch. So this way it should stay the same length and maintain its shape. So here we go, we're zigzagging literally over that straight stitch. There you go, that looks quite neat really, doesn't it? I think that's a really good alternative to an overlocker. Obviously if your machine's fancy and you have an overcast stitch, you could use that instead. So I've used the overlocker, as I said, just because I have one and it's a bit quicker. I've overlocked my side seams, and as you can see I aligned that side of the dart. I've pointed the seam allowance downwards and I've neatened all the way down to the hem. So all the way down that side seam. I've also neatened the other shoulder that I didn't do with the zigzag. And I've done all the way down this side seam too, to the hem. On the back, I'm going to be doing the same. I've got overlocked one and the zigzagged one, and another overlocked one, and all the way down the side seams, basically side seams and shoulder seams, making sure you can still see your notches or the chalk marks. Okay, so we're going to start with our shoulder seams. Here we go. Like I said, I've got one overlocked and one zigzagged just to show you the difference really. That's my front, so right sides together. I've got the front right side up, the back is right side down. I'm going to just pop a couple of pins in, match the seams. That's my overlocked one. And I'm going to stitch 1 centimetre from the edge. This is my zigzaggy one, and I'm going to do the same, pop some pins in, match those edges up, and I'm going to stitch in 1 centimetre. There we go. Again, a stitch length of 3, a little back tack to start, and off we go. And a little back tack to finish is a really good idea as well. Only needs to be a stitch or two just to secure the threads. So there we go, we've stitched both our shoulder seams. This is the overlocked one. I'm going to just pull these apart, open that seam up and give it a press, and I'm going to do the same with my zigzagged one. You can see that still looks very neat. Here we go, pressed open. Where's my other one? There it is, pressed open. Still looking very smart. From the right side you wouldn't know any different. Okay, so we're going to prep our facings, and I'm going to show you how I do it, which is block cutting. But first I'm going to show you this interfacing that I use. This one is a white one and it's a light one. It's a bonded fibres, so as you can see there's no grain. And this side's got glue on it, but you can't really see that on the camera, but it feels rough this side, so that's how I know it's the gluey side. And this side's almost sort of fleecy feeling. This one you can probably see better. This is a black one. You can see it's denser, so it's a heavier weight one. You can't see through it in the same way as the other one. And the glue, look, you can see it's shiny. You can see it much more clearly on there. So that's the part that when you press it, obviously the heat will melt that glue and it will stick to your fabric. So I like to block cut my facings, and this is how I do it. I'm just checking the straight grain. Yep, that's straight, that's straight. Okay, so that effectively is my selvage that side. I'm going to turn it over. I want a piece big enough for my facing, so I'm going to grab my interfacing and my facing piece, and I'm just going to flip it over and make sure that this area is big enough to get my whole facing out of. So then I would take my interfacing, glue side down, wrong side of fabric up, and I would again just check it's big enough, put a cloth over it, press it on the highest heat the fabric will take, and then I would fold it in half, and I'm going to pin my facing to the fabric. That's the fold. This is my straight of grain. I'm going to pin it on and cut around it. This way I don't get any stretch when I'm ironing my interfacing onto my facing. It's all cut in one. This will give it some body and some firmness and just help the neckline stay in shape. Okay, so let's look at these facings. Here are the ones that I've cut out, block cut previously, as I showed you. I've used a white interfacing, and it's actually a woven one. If you can see, there's a grain line on there. I wouldn't advise using that if you're a beginner because you have to get the grain lines matching and things, but it's basically just glue on a very, very fine cotton. The non-woven interfacings are much easier to use. You don't have to think about a straight of grain or anything. You can just pop them on any which way. Here we go. So right sides together. These are effectively your shoulder seams. So we're going to match these edges here, pop a pin in, and we're going to stitch a centimetre again from the edge. Centimetre seam allowances on all my patterns unless I otherwise say. Here we go, back tack and a back tack. That's it. So now we're left with what is essentially a hoop. There we go, we've got our seams there. I'm going to press them open. Nicely pressed seams. And now we just need to neaten the outside edge, so I'm going to use my overlocker, but again you can do the stitch and the zigzag if that's your preferred method. There we go, I'll give that a quick press. Job done. So now we're ready to get these facings attached. Here's my neckline. My dress is open at the side seams so it can lay nice and flat. And here's my facing. Make sure you've got the back neck by the back neck and the front neck by the front neck. The back neck being shallower. So you want to match these seams. So find the centre of the seam there and match it to the dress and pin those first. Again, find that seam line and match those lines together. Hard to see on this print. Pop a pin in. Then you want to lay it section by section as flat as you can. So I'm doing the back neck first, and I'm just going to lay it as flat as I can and pop a pin in the back and then some pins in between, working my way back and forth. Oops, pop another pin in there. There we go. And then I'm going to do the same for the front as well. Just piece by piece, lay it as flat as I can. We know that the neckline can't stretch because we've put our interfacing on and we've got our stay stitching, so it should fit beautifully. There we go, all pinned. Now I'm going to stitch a centimetre from the edge all the way around the inside of the circle. Now I always start at a shoulder seam and I'm stitching and I'm laying again my fabric as flat as I can as I go round. Don't rush it, it's a curve, so you need to just guide it gently as you go. Don't pull it from the back. And you can see I'm moving and arranging the fabric of the dress as I go so that I'm not getting anything caught underneath. So do take a little bit of time to do that. And then I'm reaching the side seam again, and there we go. So now I'm going to take my pins out and I'm going to do some clipping into this seam. I'm not going to grade this one because it's very light viscose. So I do little snips and I snip right up to the stitching, but not through it, obviously. But get as close as you can to your stitch line. And the rule of thumb is that the tighter the curve, the closer your snips need to be. So I'm also going to trim these little guys here. So when it goes around a really tight curve around your neck, you just want to put your snips a little bit closer together. And then when it straightens out, just make them a little bit further apart. Snip these little guys off again, just to reduce the bulk a little bit. Like I say, it's very fine viscose this, so I don't need to really grade it. It's not very thick, even with the interfacing on it. It's a very light interfacing. So now we're going to understitch or edge stitch. You can see here I've got the seam allowance in my hand and I'm just going to fold this facing over the top of it. So I'm holding on to the seam allowance. The seam allowance, look, if I turn it back over, is pointing towards the facing. So I'm going to stitch very close to the edge there, but effectively I'm going to be stitching the seam allowance to the facing. You will probably want to iron this before you start. Give it a press that seam allowance underneath. You'll see I'm adjusting as I go along, but it is far easier, certainly for beginners, if you just press it over with the iron gently before you start. Now again, take it slowly, make sure there's no fabric underneath your needle that shouldn't be. You can see the seam allowance is being stitched to the facing there, and I'm straightening out my curves as I go. So you've got all those little snips underneath which are opening up as I'm pulling the curve out of the fabric so that it becomes almost a straight line. There we go. Speeding it up a little bit now until we get to the end. Okay, so there you can see all the seam allowances stitched to the facing, and if I tuck the facing in, you can see even without pressing, it's just naturally rolling over the top there, so you can't see the facing, which is exactly what you want. So on your ironing board, lay it out really gently like that, and a little bit at a time give it a press, following your curves around. There we go, it's laying really nice, and that gives you a really lovely crisp edge to your neckline there. Another thing I like to do is sink stitch into the shoulders with the facing so that it doesn't poke out. So I'm just going to literally stitch in that seam line there. So you want to lay it flat, pop a pin in just to hold the facing to the dress, and I'm going to stitch in that ditch just for the width of the facing. It's about 4 centimetres. And again, it just helps to hold the facing back, so when you're putting it on and off, hopefully it doesn't sort of stick out. And there we go, you can see my stitch lines right in that ditch there. You want to do that on both sides. Side seams next. Now this is where all those lovely notches come in. I've put pins in mine just again to highlight them in case you can't see them very well, because the chalk doesn't show up terribly well. Hopefully you haven't lost any. You can see mine, even my little snips through the overlocking, thankfully, but here you go. You can see really clearly where the pins are. That top one matches the bust dart, where the bust dart ends, Can't see it very well on there because it's in the black, but that's where that first notch comes to. So we're going to pin that. Then we'll pin our underarm. Then we've got the next notch. You can see both those pins match there, so that's great. Pin those together, work our way down to the next one. Again, you've got lots of notches in this. You can still see my snip there. Because it's a long dress, it's very easy for things to stretch and get out of shape. So this means that you will maintain the shape and the line of your dress if you follow your notches. So that one is the 35 centimetres up from the hem. There you go, I put one in the other side as well. So I'm going to just replace that with one of them. And there we go, so that I know that's where I need to stop. I'm going to just put another one across so I know that's the end point. I want to start stitching here, all the way down. You work down from the armhole down towards the hem and stop there. That's where I'm going to back tack, where those pins cross. So here we go, back tack to start, 1 centimetre seam allowance, stitching down from the armhole to the hem. Another rule of thumb is always to stitch down, go with the flow. Down we go until we get to those crossed pins, which is where I'm going to back tack and come off. Great, side seam number 1 done. There's the split at the bottom, there's the back tack. Show you that there just to give it a bit of security. I'm going to press that seam open now. There we are, seam pressed open. Nice and flat. Let's look at the other side, make sure there's no puckers. No, nice and flat. Great, so we just need to do the same for the other side seam now. So next up we're going to prep these sleeves. Let's have a look at this pattern. So we've got double notch for the back, single notch for the front. We're just going to, again, I'm going to snip these because we're not going to overlock it first. You can use your chalk. There's a balance mark at the top there that matches to your shoulder seam. Single notch for the front of your sleeve. Make sure I've got both bits there. So yeah, use your chalk as well, or your tacking line if you choose. And you can see there's about 3 centimetres hem here. So I'm going to, there you go, 3 centimetres. I'm going to just mark that on the sides as well. It will just help later when I'm pressing up the hems as a guide. Let's get these scissors under there. So have I got the fabric as well? Right, and 3 centimetres this side. Okay, so that's our sleeve prepped. So we should have a pair of these. Yep, that's it. And I'm just going to overlock or zigzag if that's your method, these edges. There's 1, there's 2. So that's your underarm seam, or it will be. Just going to fold it right sides together now. Match the edges, pop some pins in and stitch 1 centimetre. So back tack, centimetre seam allowance, back tack at the end. Do both sleeves in the same way. There we go, that's the seam allowance there. Going to press that open. There we are, a pair of sleeves. Show you what it looks like on the right side. Nice flat seam. So now you're going to go in and find those notches or snips or chalk marks that are 3 centimetres up, and you're just going to fold up the 3 centimetres. Obviously you can mark it with chalk or pins, and then I've just pressed it up, so that's quite a nice crisp edge. And then I'm going to fold down another centimetre so that I've got a 2 centimetre hem. Give that a press too. There we go. So that's the prep for the hem. I'm going to then turn my sleeve in the other way out, or out the other way in, and always working from the inside. Start from the underarm seam, and I'm going to stitch close to the edge, that fold there. So here we go. Always stitch from the inside. You can make it lie flat. You can just get so much better access to the seam and the seam allowance this way. There we go. That's one sleeve hemmed. So you just need to do the same for the other sleeve now. So now we're going to just do something to the sleeve head, which will make things easier for you beginners. I'm going to put a gathering thread just around the top, a centimetre in from the edge, and I'm going to do it just sort of in between where these bits fold here. So just in the sleeve top bit, the sleeve head. So I'm using not a size 5 stitch, but a size 4 stitch again, because it's not for gathering, it's purely just to take up some of the ease that's in the sleeve head, which would make it much easier for you to insert it if you're a newbie. And there we go. You can see I've put that in, just one stitch line, you don't need more than one. And I'm just going to pull this bobbin thread up. And again, don't pull it so that it has gathers, but just pull it so that when you lie it flat, you can see it's starting to curve over. So it should just take the ease out of the sleeve head. So now we're going to insert the sleeves into our dress. Here's my dress, here's my sleeve. Now that's my double notch there. Double notch denotes the back of the sleeve, so I want to put that part of the sleeve into the back of the dress. So that is this sleeve, that belongs in that armhole, attaching to that part of the dress. So I'm going to go inside and I'm going to grab the side seam and the underarm seam, and I'm going to match those together and pop a pin in. Then I'm going to find my shoulder seam on my dress, there it is, and I'm going to match that to the notch that was at the top of the sleeve. Very important, otherwise you end up with a sleeve that's set too far forward or too far back, which won't be comfortable or look nice. Pop a pin in there. Next, you want to work your way around from your underarm seam, pinning inside your sleeve, and just lay your sleeve gently next to the dress fabric and pin them. Don't pull anything, just gently lay it on top and pin around until you reach our magic easing stitch. There we go, that's one side, so you want to do the same on the other side. Make sure that sleeve is in, and again pinning from the inside. There we go. Ever so gently matching it until we get to our lovely gather stitch. So we just need to pull it up a little bit more now. Now the sleeve is actually in, I can see how much ease there is. So ever so gently give it a little bit of a pull until it lies flat against the outside fabric. Pop the pins back in. Let's have a look. That should be the same length now, that inner. Yeah, that's it. It lies nice and flat. Where that stitch line is the same length as the outer fabric of the armhole. So we're going to do the same for this side. Match them up, make sure they're snug. Perfect. That lovely stitch is doing all the work for us there. So now, ever so carefully, you're going to stitch from the inside, this part here, all the way around. So start under your arm from the inside of your sleeve and take your time. Again, you can always tack this sleeve in if you're worried, if it's too tricky with the pins. Sometimes the pins can get in the way, so you'll often see me taking them out before I start because it's easier. And then I'm going to stitch directly over that easing thread there, because that thread is effectively doing all the work for us. So I don't need to worry about easing the fabric in as I go, because that thread's already holding it exactly where it needs to be. So if I stitch on top of it, it will mean that there won't be any little tucks or marks or gathers or anything. It'll be a nice smooth sleeve insertion. There we go. Keep going round, and you can see, take your time, ease the fabric. If you need to lift the foot up to adjust it, do so. Just want a nice smooth line. There we go. Back tack to finish. Let's have a look. Let's take these pins out. That looks pretty good. I can't see any tucks. You can see I've pretty much stitched on top of that gathering stitch. Let's look from the outside. Perfect. Lovely smooth sleeve insertion there. So there you go, both sleeves in. All that we need to do now is finish this edge. Again, I'm going to overlock it, but you can just stitch those two bits of fabric together with a straight stitch, trim it down and zigzag over it. There we are, nice clean finish inside. Right, let's have a look at these side vents. Right, when I press the side seams, I've pressed all the way down to the hem look, so effectively I've pressed back a centimetre seam allowance along the vent. So if you didn't do that before, you could do that now. I'm going to start here and I'm going to stitch all the way up. I'm going to back tack a bit across the top and I'm going to go all the way down to the hem again. So here we go. Stitching on the edge of that, sort of inside the overlocking really, all the way up to the top, where I will put my needle in, lift my foot up, pivot the fabric around, foot down. I'm shortening my stitch length now from the 3 down to a 1.5, and I'm going to do a little bit of back tacking, and then I'm going to put my needle down and I'm going to pivot my fabric again, and I'm going to change my stitch length back to 3 and continue down to the hem. That just gives a little bit of strength to that weak point at the top there. There we go. So that's one vent done. Just needs a little press now really. There you go, you can see there where I reduced my stitch length. It's a bit denser there and just did a back tack. You might have a fancy setting on your machine that does a little bar tack or something at the top. Give that a quick press. There we go, that's the vent done. Just repeat that for the other side. So we're at the hem now, we're nearly done. All I'm going to do for this, it's going to be super simple. Just pressed it up a centimetre and then up another centimetre. So it's what I call a turn and turn hem. So press up 1 centimetre and then press it up again another centimetre. And then you just want to stitch on the folded edge. Again, don't be afraid to use a tack or as many pins as you need to do this. Just back tack to start and stitch as close to the folded edge as you can, and just go for it really. Here we go. Back tack to start. Keep the fabric taut, but don't pull it. And just guide it through. Back tack to finish. Trim any hairy bits away. There you go, it should look a bit like that. Give it another press. I'm going to trim those little bits off. And repeat for the other part of the hem, so you've done both sides. So now we've got a lovely dress with a face neckline and these vents at the bottom and a nice hem. And hopefully yours should look something like this. Enjoy.